up today as North Korea lashes out against new UN sanctions by firing projectiles into the sea. South Korea begins work to slap its own unilateral measures on Pyongyang. The leaders of South Korea and Egypt agree to boost cooperation in infrastructure development worth more than $3.5 billion, paving the way for Seoul to make inroads into the country. Plus, there's division between the leaders of the People's Party to the main opposition party's proposal that the two join forces ahead of next month's general election. Stay tuned for these stories and more. Hello and welcome. It's 6 a.m. on Friday, March 4th here in Seoul. I'm Mark Broom and you're tuned in to our early morning edition of Arirang News. Our top story this morning, the South Korean government is discussing how to effectively implement the latest UN sanctions against North Korea. Officials are also formulating tougher unilateral sanctions to put even more pressure on the regime for its recent nuclear and missile provocations. Kwon Jang-ho starts us off.
On top of the newly agreed UN Security Council resolution, South Korea is considering a separate response to North Korea's provocations.
The U.S. announced separate sanctions, and we are also looking into what other punitive measures we can impose. I understand that the Government Policy Office is reviewing possible sanctions.
The South Korean government already had sanctions in effect since May 2010 after the sinking of the South Korean warship Cheonan, which killed 46 people. The measures halted most trade, tourism and private aid with North Korea. The only remaining symbol of inter-Korean cooperation was the joint industrial complex in Kaesong, but even that was closed by the South last month after the North launched a long-range missile. Seoul's new measures under discussion are now said to include an entry ban on all vessels that travel through North Korean waters, but an announcement will not be made until at least next week. Meanwhile, China has promised it will do its part to strictly carry out the new UN resolution. There had been concerns that Beijing and Moscow would not follow through with the sanctions due to their close economic and political ties with Pyongyang.
China has consistently and conscientiously adhered to the corresponding resolutions of the United Nations Security Council and has conscientiously implemented its international obligations. This time will be no exception.
But both China and Russia have been quick to stress that although they have agreed to the resolution, de-escalation of tensions on the Korean peninsula should remain the primary objective. Kwon Jang-ho, Arirang News.
President Park Geun-hye has expressed her gratitude to the international community after the UN Security Council unanimously adopted the toughest ever sanctions against North Korea. Song Ji-sun with the details.
In a message delivered by her press secretary on Thursday, President Park Geun-hye said the adoption of an unprecedented resolution on North Korea is a strong message from the international community for peace on the Korean peninsula and the world. President Park showed her appreciation to UN Security Council members and the international community for their efforts securing sanctions aimed at getting the North to give up its nuclear weapons.
We thank the international community for achieving such results, and we will continue to strengthen close coordination with the international community.
Attending a mass prayer meeting Thursday morning, Park said South Korea sincerely wants North Korea to take the path of change, adding that Seoul will continue to strive for the reunification of the two Koreas.
정부는 북한 정권이 무모한 핵 개발을 포기하고 북녘 동포들의 자유와 인권을 억압하는 폭정을 중지하도록 전 세계와 협력하여 노력해 나갈 것입니다.
Park added that a peaceful reunification on the Korean peninsula is a historic calling and that the government will do all it can to achieve unity and integration. Song Ji-sun, Arirang News.
Now, Russia is urging North Korea to make the right choice regarding the UN resolution and to come back to the negotiating table. The country's foreign ministry says the resolution shows the Security Council will not tolerate the North's irresponsible game of using nuclear-capable missiles. Moscow endorsed the resolution, saying it was left with no choice as Pyongyang had ignored previous resolutions calling for it to promptly abandon its nuclear and missile programs. The Russian Foreign Ministry said it hoped the North would come back to the negotiating table to ease tensions in Northeast Asia and resolve the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula. The talks are seen as referring to the six-party talks on denuclearizing North Korea that haven't been held since 2008. North Korea fired 6 short-range projectiles Thursday into the East Sea, just a few hours after the UN adopted sanctions against the regime. For more on Pyongyang's breakneck display of defiance against the international community, our Defense Ministry correspondent Kim Hyun-bin reports.
The South Korean military was on high alert after North Korea fired 6 short-range projectiles from its port city of Wonsan in Gangwon province on Thursday morning. The projectiles flew for between 100 to 150 kilometers before splashing down into the East Sea.
North Korea fired several short-range projectiles into the East Sea at 10 a.m. on Thursday. Our forces continue to monitor the situation, and we are ready for any provocations.
This is the first time the North has fired projectiles this year, and South Korea's defense ministry said it believes it was done in protest against a new UN sanctions resolution that had passed just hours beforehand. The ministry said it hasn't yet determined whether the projectiles were short-range missiles or artillery fire, but it is looking to see if they were fired from a mobile missile launcher or from a newly developed 300mm multiple rocket launcher. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said it will counter any provocations from the North and warned that reckless provocations could lead to the regime's collapse. The ministry is also monitoring the regime's key military facilities for possible signs of future provocations. Military officials say the North could conduct a short-range missile launch, cross the maritime border, or send in unmanned aerial vehicles south of the border in the near future. The North's latest provocation comes ahead of a round of annual military drills between Seoul and Washington that start next week and are slated to be the largest ever this year.
The U.S. is expected to deploy several pieces of strategic weaponry to the peninsula during the 2-month-long exercise to warn Pyongyang that the regime will pay a price for its provocations. Kim Hyun-bin, Arirang News.
More than 24 hours have passed since the UN Security Council adopted its latest resolution against North Korea, but Pyongyang has yet to issue an official response. None of the country's state-run media outlets have reported on the resolution thus far. The United States says it's closely monitoring the situation, especially after North Korea fired those projectiles into the East Sea on Thursday. A spokesperson for the U.S. State Department told Seoul-based Yonhap news agency that Washington is keeping close tabs on Pyongyang, but the South Korean government would be better able to provide more details. Now, in other news, President Park Geun-hye held summit talks with the leader of Egypt on Thursday. Discussions centered on expanding bilateral economic cooperation with a focus on Korea's participation in Egypt's large-scale projects. Our Kim Mok-yeon with the details.
President Park Geun-hye sat down Egyptian President Abdel Fattah El-Sisi, who is in Seoul for a 3-day visit, and the two leaders discussed ways to expand bilateral cooperation on economic and regional issues. Seoul and Cairo both aim to expand bilateral trade volume, which hovers at just over $2 billion. Egypt's growth remained in the 2% range after the unrest sparked by the Middle East democratization movement in 2011, also known as the Arab Spring Revolution, but the World Bank forecast it to double to the 4% range by 2015. Egypt has since aggressively launched large-scale projects to boost its economy and is seeking greater participation and investment from Korean companies. President Park and her Egyptian counterparts signed 9 MOUs on Thursday to support such initiative across diverse sectors, including trade, finance, legal, and education. Seoul is to take part in setting up Cairo's public transportation infrastructure, such as subway and railway systems, as well as desalination projects that amount to some $3.4 billion. Korea will also review taking part in building renewable energy plants like solar panel and nuclear reactors and seek to remove obstacles for Korean companies entering Egypt, like difficulties in acquiring work permits in the country. Kim Mok-yeon, Arirang News.
Another battle is brewing at Korea's National Assembly. The ruling party is calling on the opposition to pass new cyber-terrorism legislation before the session ends next week. This as the opposition continues to lodge objections to a new anti-terrorism law. Ji Myung-gil reports.
The ruling Saenuri Party said Thursday now that South Korea has a counter-terrorism law, it's time for Parliament to pass legislation on countering cyber attacks from North Korea.
North Korea's cyber attacks are another big threat to South Korea's national security. Therefore, the cyber-terrorism bill must also be passed as soon as possible. We ask for the opposition's cooperation.
Pyongyang launched a cyber attack on Seoul in July 2009, 2 months after its second nuclear test, and hacked South Korean media outlets in March 2013, a month after its third nuclear test. Meanwhile, the ruling party hailed the passage of the counterterrorism law, which went through after the main opposition party ended its 9-day filibuster against the legislation. Under the new law, a control tower for the government's anti-terrorism measures will be set up under the Prime Minister's office. The National Intelligence Service will then be allowed to collect information on terror suspects, including private communications, travel, and financial transactions. The expansion of the spy agency's power was what drew the objections of the main opposition Minju Party of Korea, which criticized the ruling party for passing the legislation unilaterally after the opposition walked out of parliament in protest.
The counterterrorism law was an act of terror on South Korean citizens' basic rights and the constitution, as it will infringe on people's human rights. President Park Geun-hye and the Saenuri Party have chosen the spy agency over citizens' rights and democracy.
With the battle for the counterterrorism bill over, the Saenuri Party now hopes to push for passage of another contentious set of bills aimed at labor market reform. But there are two main concerns: that there's not much time before the current parliamentary session ends next Thursday, and that lawmakers' focus will soon turn to the general election in April. Ji Myung-gil, Arirang News.
Now, staying with domestic politics, and Korea's opposition bloc is split over how to best approach the upcoming general election, which is set for mid-April. The main opposition party wants the top players to rejoin forces to defeat the ruling party, but the co-chairman of a recently formed Liberal Party has rejected the proposal. Lee Ji-won reports.
While An Cheol-soo, co-chairman of the minor opposition People's Party, is firm in his decision to reject the main opposition Minju Party's suggestion to form a unified opposition bloc, the other co-chairman Chun Jung-bae and Representative Kim Han-gil are showing otherwise. During his visit to Busan on Thursday, An Cheol-soo criticized the Minju Party, saying that the suggestion is actually an act of political sabotage to stop the People's Party from surging as the number 3 camp in the country's political arena. Meanwhile, the Minju Party's interim leader Kim Jong-un criticized An for basing his decision on his personal interest to win the next presidential race. If An decides to join the Minju Party only after a month of defecting it and launching his own party, his image would be critically damaged and irreversibly affect his candidacy in the next presidential election. Although Chun Jung-bae and Kim Han-gil have not officially made their statements yet, pundits are seeing the time the two heavyweights are taking to consider the main opposition's proposal as an indication that the two are leaning towards forming a pan-coalition. Lee Ji-won, Arirang News.
Now, China's top advisory body has kicked off the country's political high season. Eyes are on the National People's Congress, where Chinese Premier Li Keqiang will announce his country's growth forecast for 2016. He will do so on Saturday. Hwang Ji-ae with the details.
Around 2,000 political and business leaders, as well as provincial administrators in China on Thursday, gathered in the capital city of Beijing to take part in the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the country's top political advisory body. The conference marks the opening of the so-called Two Sessions event, with the key National People's Congress kicking off on Saturday. Their Premier Li Keqiang's work report is expected to receive a lot of attention, as it will contain the country's growth forecast for 2016. Media outlets are forecasting 6.5% to 7% to replace last year's target of 7% range growth, which Lee described as the new normal of slower yet safer and more sustainable growth focusing on domestic consumption over government investment. And China plans to do so with its 13th five-year plan, a roadmap for the nation's development from 2016 to 2020.
The focus of implementing the 13th five-year development plan is to reform the supply-side structure, cutting down on excessive production capacity and inventories and leverage, reducing costs and strengthening weaknesses.
While the economy is forecast to be a major focus, air pollution, especially Beijing's chronic smog, is also expected to be high on the agenda. Hwang Jie, Arirang News.
French President François Hollande has warned that there will be consequences if Britain leaves the European Union, including over immigration matters. Despite his strong words at the conclusion of a one-day Anglo-French summit in the French city of Amiens, Hollande did admit that a so-called Brexit would not be catastrophic. British Prime Minister David Cameron said Britain was stronger, safer and better off within a reformed EU. Now, the leaders also announced a $2.1 billion deal to develop combat drones. The British public will vote on whether to stay in or leave the European Union on June 23rd. Well, that's all we have for now on this Friday morning here in Seoul. I'm Mark Broom. Thank you, as always, for watching. The weekend is almost here, so if we don't see you again, enjoy that. And we'll be back throughout the day as well with more newscasts. So until then, goodbye.